If you asked almost anyone to name the most iconic French food, chances are they would say the croissant. It's printed on postcards, stacked behind the glass of Parisian bakeries, and served every morning in cafes from the Champs-Élysées to the smallest villages in Provence. For millions of people, the croissant isn't just breakfast, it is France. But history tells a very different story. The pastry that became one of the greatest symbols of French culture wasn't actually born in France. No French baker invented it. No Parisian bakery created its famous crescent shape. In fact, the earliest version of the croissant existed centuries before France ever claimed it as its own. Even more surprising, two of the stories most people believe about its origin, the heroic bakers who saved Vienna from the Ottoman Empire and Queen Marie Antoinette introducing it to France, are almost certainly myths. They appear in countless travel guides, documentaries, and cookbooks, yet historians have found little evidence that either story actually happened. So how did an ordinary Austrian bread become the world's most famous French pastry? The answer involves forgotten medieval recipes, political revolutions, one ambitious Austrian entrepreneur, and a French baking technique so revolutionary that it transformed a simple bread roll into something entirely new. By the end of this story, you'll never look at a croissant the same way again. Because this isn't just the history of a pastry. It's the story of how entire nations can reshape history, one bite at a time. But before France entered the picture, we have to travel back nearly 800 years, to a bread almost nobody remembers today. Long before buttery layers and flaky crumbs became the standard, there was a much simpler bread known as the kipferl. The name comes from an old German word meaning small crescent, describing its distinctive moon-like shape. Unlike today's croissant, however, the kipferl was dense, soft, and filling. It was made from enriched dough containing flour, yeast, butter, or sometimes lard, and occasionally a little sugar. Rather than shattering into delicate flakes, it had the chewy texture of a rich bread roll. Historical records show crescent-shaped breads being baked in Austria as early as the 13th and 14th centuries, making the kipferl one of Europe's oldest surviving pastries. While recipes varied from region to region, its shape remained remarkably consistent for hundreds of years. At the time, Vienna was becoming one of Europe's great cultural capitals. Under the Habsburg dynasty, the city developed an extraordinary baking tradition. Royal banquets featured elaborate cakes, sugar sculptures, and luxurious desserts designed to display wealth and political influence. Ironically, the kipferl wasn't part of that glamorous world. It wasn't reserved for nobles or royalty. It wasn't considered a masterpiece. Instead, it was everyday food. The kind of bread workers picked up on their way to work, families ate with coffee, and bakers produced every morning without giving it much thought. No famous artist painted it. No poet celebrated it. It simply existed, quietly feeding generations for centuries. And perhaps that's exactly why history nearly forgot it. Because the world's most famous pastries rarely begin as luxury foods. They usually begin as something ordinary. But if the kipferl had already existed for centuries, where did the famous story about saving Vienna come from? Ask someone how the croissant was invented, and chances are they'll tell you a dramatic story. It begins in 1683, when the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna. According to the legend, enemy soldiers secretly tunneled beneath the city's walls during the night, hoping to launch a surprise attack. The only people awake were Vienna's bakers, already preparing bread before sunrise. Hearing strange noises beneath their bakeries, the bakers supposedly alerted the city's defenders. The attack failed, Vienna survived, and to celebrate the victory, they created a crescent-shaped pastry representing the symbol found on Ottoman banners. Every bite, the story says, symbolized defeating the enemy. It's an unforgettable tale. There's just one problem. Almost none of it can be verified. Modern historians overwhelmingly agree that crescent-shaped kipferl had already existed for centuries before the siege ever took place. Documents mentioning these breads appear hundreds of years earlier, making it impossible for the pastry to have been invented in 1683. Even more revealing, no contemporary records from the siege mention heroic bakers, underground tunnels, or celebratory pastries. The story doesn't appear until more than 2 centuries later, when food writers began repeating it as historical fact. Once the legend entered popular culture, it spread everywhere. Travel books, television shows, cooking programs, and eventually, the internet. People wanted a dramatic origin story. Reality was much quieter, and yet the truth, as you'll soon discover, is arguably even more fascinating. Because the croissant didn't conquer France through war. It conquered France through business. And the man responsible wasn't a baker by trade. He was a former artillery officer with an unexpected idea. The man who truly changed the future of the croissant wasn't a royal chef, a celebrated baker, or even a member of France's culinary elite. He was an Austrian artillery officer named August Zang. Born in Vienna in 1807, Zang spent his early adulthood serving in the Austrian military. But unlike many officers of his generation, he saw greater opportunity outside the battlefield. During a visit to Paris in the late 1830s, he noticed something unexpected. Although French cuisine was admired across Europe, its bread lacked the richness and variety he had grown up enjoying in Vienna. Rather than complain, Zang saw a business opportunity. He returned to Austria to study the city's baking traditions more closely, before coming back to Paris with experienced Viennese bakers and a business partner, Ernest Schwarzer. In 1838, they opened the Boulangerie Viennoise on Rue de Richelieu, introducing Parisians to Austrian specialties they had rarely, if ever, tasted before. But Zang's success wasn't driven by recipes alone. He embraced ideas that were remarkably modern. His bakery used advanced steam ovens that produced lighter, shinier bread than most Parisian bakeries could manage. He advertised in newspapers, designed elegant storefront displays, and carefully built an image of quality and sophistication. The strategy worked brilliantly. At first, the bakery attracted Austrian expatriates longing for familiar flavors. Soon afterward, curious Parisians began lining up outside the shop. What had started as a foreign bakery quickly became one of the city's most talked-about food destinations. Within only a few years, dozens of French bakers began copying Viennese bread and pastries. Zang had unintentionally sparked a baking revolution. But despite introducing the pastry to France, what Zang sold still wasn't the croissant we recognize today. That transformation would require one uniquely French invention. By the mid-1800s, Viennese bakeries had become fashionable across Paris. French customers loved the shape of the kipferl, its buttery flavor, and its connection to Vienna's sophisticated café culture. But despite its growing popularity, it was still a dense bread roll, not the light, flaky pastry we know today. The real transformation happened inside French bakeries. Long before the croissant existed, French pastry chefs had already mastered one of the most demanding techniques in baking: lamination. Used for puff pastry since the 17th century, the process required folding cold butter repeatedly into dough, creating dozens of alternating layers. It demanded perfect timing, precise temperatures, and extraordinary patience. Even a slight mistake could ruin an entire batch. For decades, these two traditions remained separate. The Austrians had the crescent-shaped bread. The French had the technique. No one had thought to combine them. That changed in the early 20th century. French bakers began applying laminated dough to the traditional kipferl, replacing the heavy enriched dough with delicate layers of butter and yeast dough. During baking, the water trapped inside the butter turned into steam, gently lifting each paper-thin layer apart. Instead of producing a soft bread roll, the oven created hundreds of tiny air pockets that gave the pastry its signature crisp exterior and honeycomb interior. It wasn't simply an improved recipe. It was an entirely different product. The familiar crescent remained, but everything inside had been reinvented. The buttery aroma became richer, the texture lighter, and every bite shattered into crisp flakes unlike anything Europe had tasted before. At that moment, the Austrian kipferl stopped evolving, and the modern French croissant was finally born. But winning over Paris was only the beginning of its remarkable journey. The transformation of the croissant wasn't just culinary, it was cultural. By the late 19th century, the pastry had become a familiar sight in Parisian cafes and neighborhood bakeries. Writers, travelers, and artists increasingly associated it with the rhythm of French mornings. Visitors described sitting at sidewalk cafes with coffee and a warm croissant, long before the pastry had reached its modern form. Within just a few decades, what had begun as a foreign specialty no longer felt foreign at all. This wasn't unusual. Throughout history, countries have often absorbed outside influences and reshaped them into symbols of national identity. Italy adopted tomatoes from the Americas. Britain embraced tea from China and India. France was now doing something similar with the croissant. As French bakers refined laminated dough throughout the early 20th century, the pastry became lighter, flakier, and unmistakably different from its Austrian ancestor. Recipes grew more standardized. Bakeries competed to perfect their techniques, and customers came to expect a level of quality that only skilled craftsmanship could deliver. Gradually, people stopped asking where the croissant came from. Instead, they simply assumed it had always belonged to France. It appeared in postcards, novels, paintings, travel advertisements, and eventually films. For visitors arriving in Paris, eating a croissant became almost a ritual, a small but essential part of experiencing French culture. That quiet shift was perhaps the greatest success of all. Without rewriting history books, France had successfully rewritten public memory. Within a single generation, an Austrian bread had become one of the strongest culinary symbols of an entirely different nation. But just as France perfected the croissant by hand, another country was about to transform it forever, not through craftsmanship, but through mass production. By the middle of the 20th century, the croissant had already secured its place as France's signature breakfast pastry. But the next chapter of its history wouldn't unfold in Paris. It would happen thousands of miles away, in American factories. For generations, making croissants had been a craft reserved for highly trained bakers. Every batch demanded hours of folding, resting, proofing, and shaping. It was expensive, labor-intensive, and impossible to produce on a truly massive scale without sacrificing consistency. Then frozen dough technology changed everything. In the early 1980s, food manufacturers perfected a method of freezing laminated croissant dough without destroying its delicate structure. Bakeries, hotels, supermarkets, and restaurants could now receive frozen dough, store it for weeks, and bake fresh-looking croissants whenever they needed them. Suddenly, producing hundreds of identical pastries no longer required a master baker, only an oven. The impact was immediate. Fast food chains recognized an opportunity. Instead of serving ordinary bread for breakfast sandwiches, they began using croissants filled with eggs, cheese, bacon, and sausage. The pastry that had once symbolized elegant Parisian mornings was now appearing in drive-through windows across America. Ironically, millions of people experienced their very first croissant not in France, but through mass-produced versions served alongside coffee in shopping malls, airports, and highway restaurants. For the first time in history, the croissant had become a global commodity rather than a local craft. Its popularity exploded, but its identity became more complicated than ever. Because while the world celebrated French baking, something unexpected was happening inside France itself, and many traditional bakers weren't happy about it. Today, millions of tourists visit France, expecting every croissant to be handcrafted by a baker who woke before sunrise. The smell drifting from neighborhood bakeries certainly makes it feel that way. But the reality is far more complicated. Walk into a typical French bakery, and the croissants may indeed come out of the oven that morning. They may be warm, golden, and perfectly crisp. Yet in many cases, the dough itself was never mixed, folded, or shaped in that bakery at all. Instead, it arrived frozen from a factory. Over the past several decades, industrial production has quietly reshaped the French baking industry. Large manufacturers now prepare laminated dough in enormous facilities using highly controlled equipment, capable of producing thousands of nearly identical croissants every hour. The frozen dough is then delivered to bakeries across the country, where it is proofed overnight and baked fresh before customers arrive. To most people, there is almost no visible difference. The aroma is genuine. The crust still crackles. The butter still melts in your mouth. But many artisan bakers argue that something important has been lost. Handmade croissants are never perfectly identical. Small differences in folding, fermentation, and shaping give each pastry its own character. Experienced bakers adjust their dough according to humidity, temperature, and even the quality of that week's butter, decisions no factory production line can fully replicate. For them, the croissant isn't simply a recipe. It's a craft passed from one generation to the next. That belief has inspired campaigns promoting handcrafted pastries and encouraging customers to support bakeries that still make their dough entirely by hand. Yet despite this struggle between craftsmanship and convenience, the croissant's journey was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning its transformation into one of the world's most adaptable foods. Once the croissant could be produced on an industrial scale, its journey accelerated beyond anything August Zang or the bakers of medieval Vienna could have imagined. As French cuisine gained international prestige throughout the 20th century, the croissant became one of its most recognizable ambassadors. But instead of remaining unchanged, it adapted to every culture it encountered. In Italy, it evolved into the sweeter cornetto, often filled with vanilla cream, chocolate, or fruit jam, and enjoyed with a morning espresso. In Spain, bakers experimented with deep-fried versions dusted in sugar or filled with rich custards. Across Japan and South Korea, artisan bakeries transformed the croissant into an art form, introducing flavors like matcha, black sesame, yuzu, and sweet red bean, while preserving the delicate laminated texture. Then came the age of social media. Suddenly, bakeries weren't competing only on taste. They were competing for attention. Croissants became larger, crispier, and more elaborate. Some were stuffed with pistachio cream, others coated in caramelized sugar, and many were shaped into cubes, spirals, or oversized rolls designed to dominate Instagram feeds. Perhaps the most famous reinvention arrived in 2013, when New York pastry chef Dominique Ansel introduced the cronut, a hybrid of croissant and donut. Customers waited in line for hours, and within weeks, bakeries around the world were creating their own versions. At that point, the croissant had evolved beyond a single recipe. It had become a format, a foundation that every culture could reinterpret through its own ingredients, traditions, and imagination. The pastry that once traveled from Austria to France was now traveling everywhere, constantly changing while somehow remaining instantly recognizable. But after centuries of transformation, one question still remains: who does the croissant really belong to? So, was the croissant invented in France? Not exactly. Its earliest ancestor was the Austrian kipferl, a humble crescent-shaped bread that had existed for centuries before Paris embraced it. The famous legends of heroic bakers and Queen Marie Antoinette may be entertaining, but history offers little evidence to support them. Instead, the croissant's remarkable journey was shaped by ordinary people, bakers, entrepreneurs, and craftsmen whose names are often forgotten. Auguste Zang carried Viennese baking traditions to Paris. French pastry chefs transformed those traditions using laminated dough, creating the flaky masterpiece the world knows today. American food companies made it available on a global scale. And modern bakers continue reinventing it with new flavors, techniques, and ideas. In many ways, the croissant reflects the history of civilization itself. Ideas travel, cultures borrow from one another. Innovation rarely happens in isolation. The foods we consider traditional are often the result of centuries of exchange, adaptation, and reinvention across borders. Perhaps that's why the croissant remains so fascinating. It isn't a symbol of one nation defeating another or one culture claiming ownership forever. Instead, it's proof that great ideas become greater when people improve upon them rather than simply preserve them. The next time you hold a warm croissant, you're holding far more than breakfast. You're holding nearly 8 centuries of migration, craftsmanship, experimentation, and cultural exchange, wrapped in hundreds of delicate layers of butter and dough. The Austrians imagined it. The French perfected it. The world made it its own. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary recipe of all. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden history behind one of the world's most famous foods, don't forget to subscribe and let us know which iconic dish you'd like to explore next.